screenshot it. So let's look at number 2 here. Which choice from the table uses data from the table to most effectively support the researcher's conclusion? So what is that conclusion? So researchers investigated within species competition, so competition among toads of this particular species, and this is a species that secretes various unpleasant tasting toxins called, we could just say B, but bufadienolides in response to threats. The researchers tested the tadpoles' responses to different levels of competition by creating ponds with different tadpole population densities but a fixed amount of food. So the amount of food was constant, but the population density varied. So based on analysis of the tadpoles after 3 weeks, the researchers concluded that increased competition drove bufadienolide production at the expense of growth. So again, fairly technical, but we can see here that, and just to write this down briefly, as the competition increases, bufadienolide production also would have increased, but growth would have decreased. And then competition, in turn, we could say, that would be a result of density. So if the density is high, competition is going to be high. They're going to secrete a lot of this nasty chemical, but perhaps the process of producing that chemical takes away resources that they would otherwise use to grow bigger. So we want to see here then that, okay, in the high density condition, the mass is lower. And so I'll do a little highlighting here. A low mass corresponds to low growth, and then the high density. I wish I had another highlighter color that was a little light, but these other highlighter colors are kind of dark, but those would match up. Also, the bufadienolide production is highest in this condition, and that is also something that we would expect based on the passage here. So that is a higher number, and we would expect that to be higher as well. Okay, so something like that. The difference in average tadpole body mass was small between the low and medium population density conditions, and larger between the low and high population density conditions. And my first thought here is that this doesn't mention everything that needs to be mentioned. It needs to mention both bufadienolide production and growth. And so I don't think we need to worry too much about A. B, tadpoles in the low and medium population density conditions had substantially lower average bufadienolide concentrations, but had greater average body masses than those in the high population density condition. And that is accurate because they've got low and medium. Those are pretty similar. But okay, so this is one of these where it's talking about the relevant variables, but I would not say that these two are substantially lower than that, because I'll uncover this so that we can see it a little bit more clearly. These two are actually closer together, whereas that's much lower. So B was looking good, but I don't think we want to pick B because I don't think that's quite accurate. So I always want to check relevance first, then accuracy, because that's just a little bit more efficient. It takes time to go over to the graph and look at all the numbers and stuff, but I don't think we want to pick B. C, tadpoles in the high population density condition displayed a relatively modest increase in the average amount of bufadienolide, but roughly double the amount of concentrate. No, this doesn't talk about growth. Tadpoles produced approximately the same number of toxins per individual across the population density conditions. I mean, that's accurate, but that's not something that they're talking about in the passage. And so average bufadienolide concentration. Oh, okay. I was looking at the wrong column earlier. here I think we can say that these are substantially lower. And so average bufadienolide concentration. So I was looking at that column, and I'm not sure why they're zeroing in on this as opposed to that. Per tadpole average concentration. But still, I mean, that is accurate. It is going to have to be B here. It's going to have to be B because it's accurate that these are substantially lower than that. And it's also accurate that these are greater than that. And so it will be B. Okay, so tough questions so far, tough questions. Data that supports the team's conclusion. So employing high-performance liquid chromatography, a process that uses pressurized water to separate material into its component molecules, researchers analyzed 2 samples of a meteorite that landed in Australia, as well as soil from the landing zone of the meteorite to determine the concentration of various molecules. Okay, so we've got our landing site and then the soil. Okay, so the soil and then the meteor. Okay, and so by comparing the relative concentrations of types of molecules known as nucleobases in the meteorite with those in the soil, they concluded that there is evidence that the nucleobases in the meteorite formed in space and are not the result of contamination on Earth. Contamination on Earth. Okay, so what kind of evidence would support that? Evidence that there's going to be something in the meteorite that is not in the soil. And let's just make sure that makes sense. So the relative concentrations of material, right? Because if there's something found here that wasn't in the soil itself, then that means that the presence of that same substance in the meteorite can't be explained. It couldn't have gotten there as a result of interacting with or hitting that soil. Okay, so I would focus on those 2 substances. So isoguanine and purine, they were detected in both meteorite samples but not in the soil samples. And here finally we get one where our answer choices are relatively brief and we can zero in on the variables, and that's really the important thing because adenine and xanthine, isoguanine, well, yes, but not hypoxanthine, and then hypoxanthine and purine. So A has neither of the ones we're looking for. B and D both have one of the ones we're looking for and one of the ones we're not looking for, and only C identifies both of those. Which choice most effectively uses data from the table to complete the statement? In Caddo, a language from what is now the U.S. Southeast, vocabulary pertaining to or relating to corn cultivation resembles equivalent vocabulary in, we'll just call this the T language family in Mexico. This resemblance is perhaps attributable to cultural contact. Such words could have entered Caddo through the intermediary of the neighboring but unrelated Chitimacha language, concurrent with the dissemination or spread of corn itself from Mexico into the southeast after 700 AD CE. The fact that the vocabulary pertaining to domestic crops accompanies them as they diffuse or spread into new regions is an established phenomenon globally. Crops may also become decoupled from vocabulary altogether. So if they're decoupled, they are separated. And what does that mean? Well, this is going to expand on that previous point. corn cultivation became ubiquitous or widespread among the southeastern tribes, yet blank. Okay, this is another tough one, but if crops can become decoupled from vocabulary altogether, that would mean that even if corn cultivation became ubiquitous or widespread among these tribes, but we do not have an origin. Okay, so we've got all these different words for corn. Here's one, here's one, here's one, and here's one. Some of these had a proposed origin in this language family. So this resemblance is perhaps attributable to cultural context. Such words could have entered this language through this neighboring Chitimacha language. And so that would be a case where they do have a common origin. And then Caddoan is another one where there could be a common origin, but it can also become decoupled. And so we would be looking for Muskogean or Iroquoian tribe, the Muskogee tribe. Okay, so in the Muskogee and Iroquois language families, the word for corn doesn't have an origin in this language family. I don't think we want to pick this because there's nothing about Cherokee in the graph. Words for corn in the languages of the Muskogean family evolved from a common root. Chickasaw and Choctaw. Oh, never mind. I was wrong on A. That's tricky because the word and the language family, but the language. Wow. Okay. The origins of vocabulary vary across languages in the region, with the words for corn in Cherokee and Muskogee languages showing no demonstrable relationship to this family. So I actually do think it will be A. C, corn-related vocabulary underwent changes when entering other unrelated languages, as can be seen by the divergence. No, that doesn't make any sense here. The region is linguistically diverse, being home not only to this and that, but also to this family. Well, this is only talking about the languages and not even the words for corn in the languages. And so, yes, that would be A. And I wish I had a bigger takeaway point from this one, but just kind of have to read carefully. These are questions that are often smart to save until the end of the section, the end of the module, so that you have time to actually focus on them without spending so much time that you prevent yourself from having enough time to do others. But anyway, here we'll just go ahead and move on to number 5. So data to complete the statement. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics releases an annual traffic data report for U.S. airlines and foreign airlines serving the U.S. This release includes data on U.S. airlines' domestic and international flights, including from one foreign point to another foreign point, as well as on foreign airlines to and from the U.S. So U.S. domestic and international flights, and then flights to and from the U.S. from foreign airlines. The data show an increase in the number of passengers on all types of flights in the system in 2019. However, the increase in passengers on domestic flights was greater than the increase in passengers on international flights. And it looks like I might have cut off the blank here because it says from 2018 to 2019, we'd have a blank. Okay, so domestic increase 4.3%, international 3.8%. we're not really, and then these would also be international. So let me do a little color coding here to clarify that. So the two types of international flights would be ones on or beginning on or on U.S. airlines or foreign airlines, because if it's going from a foreign airline to or from the U.S., that's still international. So both of those are in the international category, whereas the domestic one up there. So 4.3 versus 3.8 and 1.2. Yep, so it's going to be A. And that's always nice, because we don't have to read the other ones. But since we're going through these, here we can just look at them. You can always use the timestamps to skip ahead to number 6. But there was a 4.2% increase in passengers on U.S. No, that's inaccurate. It was only a 4.2% increase on domestic flights, not international flights. These are the wrong numbers. And all flights is not relevant. It's all about domestic versus international. I think this is the best one yet in terms of demonstrating the importance of identifying the relevant variables, and in the sense that that's going to help really get through the answer choices more quickly. So which choice most effectively uses data from the graph that supports the student's assertion? So what is the student's assertion? A sociology student is reading an essay on the median age of first marriage in Western countries throughout the 20th century. The author of the essay cites factors common to these countries that the author believes caused an increase in the median age of first marriage. So, meaning they would be a little bit older at the time of their first, hopefully their last marriage as well, but their first marriage, such as new technologies that shortened the time needed for domestic chores, making two-person households less necessary and living alone more viable. The student asserts that beyond these factors, there must be additional ones specific to particular Western countries that influenced the increase of age at first marriage. Okay, and so this is kind of open-ended. There must be additional factors beyond. What are these ones again? New technologies. Okay. And so it shows here men and women, and then in three countries, United States, England and Wales, United States, England and Wales. So if we trace just one of them, okay, men in England and Wales, okay, they are on average the oldest, and they're increasing from about, 28 in 1900 to about 35 in the year 2000. What do we see next? We see women in England and Wales as the next oldest. And then we have men in the United States down here, and women in the United States down here. So I've run out of colors here, but down there. Okay, so if we step back, we've got the United States men and women down here getting at an average age of about 25, yep. And then in the UK or England and Wales, we've got, I'm just going to put UK because they're both in the United Kingdom, right? They're both up there at about 32 to 35. And so the reason that our student is suggesting that there must be some other factors particular to or specific to particular Western countries is that there is this difference between the UK and the US. Okay, so between 1970 and 2000, the median age of first marriage rose more sharply for men in England and Wales than it did for men in the United States. Yes, but that's focusing only on men. So I don't know. I'm going to say maybe. B, between 1900 and 2000, the median age of first of marriage for women in England and Wales was consistently higher than for women in the United States. as was the case for men. And that is true also, but if it was consistently higher, that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the rate of change. So I'm going to put maybe beside that too. I don't like having two maybes, but that's just what we've got here. C, the median age of first marriage for men in England and Wales was lower in 1970 than in 1950 or 1990. I mean, even if that's true, it is true, but that's not relevant, because the overall trend is that they've been getting older. So to point out something that runs counter to the trend for just one country or one set of countries doesn't really do much for us. We need to show really a difference between the UK and the US. In England and Wales, the median age of first marriage was consistently higher for men than for women. Okay, so that's an irrelevant distinction. Why? Because it's not about men versus women. It's about England and Wales versus the United States. So I had the two maybes. One of them needs to be correct. Between 1970 and 2000, the median age of first marriage rose more sharply for men in England and Wales than it did in the United States. So in the United States, it rose from about 23 to about 26. It's very hard to see that. In the UK, it rose from about 28 to about 35. So that is a sharper increase. But why would we focus on 1970 to 2000? This is tricky, actually, because, okay, let's think about this. With A, it's only talking about men, and 1970 to 2000. But on the other hand, it is at least talking about a change, how quickly it rose. With B, the good thing is that it's talking about men and women, as opposed to just one or the other. But it's talking about, saying it was consistently higher. And while that is true, that wouldn't tell us much about the rate of change. The increase of age at first marriage, the increase throughout the 20th century, the increase. I would go with A here, but I'm actually going to check the answers because I'm not 100% sure on this one. Okay, so here we have the official explanation. And so it was A. What do they say about it? They say that the student concluded that the country-specific factors influence changes to median age of first marriage. This choice describes a time period when the rate of change differed. Yeah, so it was the rate of change that was the important thing. Whereas B, it's going to say that the student's conclusion is about changes. This choice provides broad information about the century as a whole, so it doesn't give insight into how median age at first marriage changed over time. Data to support the underlying claim. So, economist so-and-so has shown that divided U.S. Congresses, which occur when one party holds the majority in the House and another in the Senate, tend to accompany reductions in total federal outlays or spending relative to gross domestic product, which Henke interprets to reflect decreases in government size. Okay, so in other words, when you have a divide between these two legislative bodies, they're less likely to agree on federal spending. And so you're going to have less spending, as they say, relative to the overall economy's size at that point in time. Yep. Okay, so he calculated the percentage point change in total outlays for consecutive U.S. Congresses. He has pointed to his calculations as evidence that a divided Congress may be a necessary but not sufficient condition for a decrease in government size to occur. Okay, necessary but not sufficient. What does that mean? I'll give just a little analogy or example from math, actually, in case that phrase doesn't quite make sense. So if I tell you that something has 4 right angles, well, that is a necessary condition for something to be a square, right? Having 4 right angles is a necessary condition, but it isn't sufficient because something could have 4 right angles and be a non-square. It could be a rectangle that's not a square. So possessing 4 right angles is necessary but not sufficient for that shape, being a square. Okay, necessary but not sufficient. So in this case, to be necessary but not sufficient, that would mean that you would only have a negative change in total outlays, a decrease in total outlays, which, as it says here, government size reductions in total outlays. So in other words, when you have a reduction in total outlays, that means a reduction in government size. So to be necessary but not sufficient, it would mean that the only times when you have a negative change here or a decrease in total outlays, you would need to have a divided Congress, but that merely having a divided Congress doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a negative change in total outlays. So it's kind of, again, like it's necessary for something to have 4 right angles in order to be a square, but just because you have 4 right angles doesn't mean that it's going to be a square. And so I think all 3 of these are relevant in this case. The periods of undivided Congresses, no. We want to look at the... No, let's go ahead and read A. The periods of undivided Congresses were associated with increases. But see, I don't think we care about non-defense outlays versus defense outlays. We care about total outlays. I really don't think that's an important distinction at all in this case. All the periods of divided Congresses except one were associated with reductions in total outlays, whereas the periods of undivided Congresses were associated with increases in total outlays. That looks good. I mean, all but one is kind of weird when you only have 3 to begin with, but I think that's correct. All the periods of divided Congresses were associated with reductions in total outlays. Nope, not true. 2 of the 3 were, but not all 3. The periods of undivided Congresses were associated with increases in total outlays, whereas all the periods of divided Congresses were associated with reductions in either non-defense outlays or defense. So that's making a distinction that isn't relevant. And I think that's another important thing to keep in mind. When we're doing these questions, we want to make sure that we're looking both at the, as I always use the term, relevant variables, the variables that are involved in the comparison, the conclusion or whatever it is, but they're also going to be like comparisons that are or are not relevant. And in this case, the only relevant comparison would have to do with divided versus undivided in terms of total outlays. There's nothing in the underlined statement that makes a distinction between defense and non-defense outlays. It's really about the total one, because it says here total outlays, total federal outlays. That's what reflects government size to this economist, Steve Hanke. And so D is doing something we don't want it to do, so it's going to be B. Data from the graph to weaken the hypothesis. Okay, so a little extra, perhaps, degree of difficulty here, but weaken the hypothesis. So first of all, we want to find the hypothesis. So in the United States, firms often seek incentives from municipal or local governments to expand to those municipalities. Okay, so firms like Apple Computer might come to the government of Anytown, USA, and say, can you give us a tax break so that we can relocate to your area and build, or build an office center in your area, and we'll bring all these economic benefits to your area. So you want us to come there, but you should give us some benefits so that we choose your town and not some other town. Okay, so a team of political scientists hypothesized that municipalities are much more likely to respond to firms and offer incentives if the expansions can be announced in time to benefit local officials. Okay. In other words, if the idea here would be that, Apple Computer is moving to the area, that's going to be beneficial to the area. And so if the local mayor or whomever can announce that, then in time for the next election, that's going to boost his chances or her chances of winning that election. But if they can't announce it before the next election, maybe they're going to be less likely to respond. So the team contacted officials in thousands of municipalities inquiring about incentives for a firm looking to expand and indicating that the firm would announce its expansion on a date either just before or just after the next election. Okay, so if it's going to weaken the hypothesis, we just need to show that they are not more likely to respond in these scenarios. We don't have to show that they are less likely to respond. We just have to show that they are not more likely to respond. And what I see here is that the differences are pretty similar in each of these cases. Which one, though, do we want to focus on, or which ones? They're more likely to respond to firms and offer incentives if expansions can be announced in time or not. And so I would say the important ones are going to be these two, because basically there's not much difference. I mean, they're essentially the same. And so a large majority of the municipalities that received an inquiry didn't respond. That's not irrelevant here. It's about being more likely if the announcement could be made before as opposed to after the election. The proportion of municipalities that responded to the inquiry or offered incentives didn't substantially differ across the announcement timing conditions. So the two conditions would be announcing it before the election, announcing it after the election. And there wasn't a substantial difference in either the percentage or the amount, not the number, responding to the inquiry or offering incentives. So this one is going to be B. But let's look at the other two. So around half the municipalities that responded to inquiries mentioning plans for an announcement before the next election offered incentives. Maybe that's true, but it's also true that around half of the ones that didn't, half of them didn't. Half of them did, half of them didn't. So they're no more likely in one or the other, as opposed to the other. So then D, of the municipalities that received an inquiry mentioning plans for an announcement date after the election, more than 1,200 didn't respond. Again, that might be true, but we really want to make the comparison again between, if they can, then if they can't. So maybe here, again, to help color code this, if they can't, that's going to correspond to announcing it after the election. If it is announced in time, that would correspond to this. So we're looking at those two conditions, and there really isn't a substantial difference, and so our answer is going to be B. Data to support the assertion, and I've got it in here twice. Okay, to assess the impact of invasive species on ecosystems in Africa, these researchers reviewed government reports from those nations about how invasive species are undermining or weakening ecosystem services, that is, aspects of the ecosystem on which residents depend. Okay, so the services were sorted into three categories: provisioning, regulating, and cultural. Ego and her team, the researchers, assert that So that we want to know something about their assertion or support their assertion. Countries in each region reported effects on provisioning services, and provisioning services represent the majority of the reported services. Okay, so provisioning here, is it the majority? Yes, 73%, 88%, 79%, 83%. Okay, so I think here the idea is, the majority of the reported services. I think it doesn't have to be the majority in each area, the majority in each region, because that wouldn't be accurate here. But it says that they reported effects, and I guess reported them as opposed to something like that where you have nothing. So like here, 3 regions did not report any cultural effects. All regions reported at least some provisioning effects and some regulating effects, for that matter. But all of them reported something, and it was the majority. Okay, so provisioning services represent. No, A might be accurate, but it's not really. The but doesn't really make any sense here. And why would you focus just on those two? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. B, none of the percentages are lower than 33%. I would say it's more to the point that all of them are greater than 0%, and the overall percentage is 75%. So I think it's going to be B. C, provisioning services are shown for each region. I mean, C is accurate as far as it goes, but it doesn't say anything about representing the majority, whereas this is only talking about things within that category. And so yes, so it's going to be B. None of the percentages are lower than 33%. All of them are greater than 0%, and the overall percentage is 75%. So this one has a lot of information on it, so I've had to rearrange the text here. So data to support the researcher's claim. So we'll come and look at this in just a second, but we'll read this first. So researchers conducted a study on the effects of different temperatures and humidity levels on the survival of bees from this particular species. Worker bees were placed in temperature and humidity controlled boxes. Temperatures of 35, 40, and 45 Celsius at constant relative humidity, and at relative humidity levels of 50, 60, and 70% at constant temperature were tested. Okay, so this is 6 different conditions. 1, 2, 3 variables in terms of the temperature for a given humidity level, and then 1, 2, 3 categories or percentages of humidity at a constant temperature. The bee survival time for each box was calculated as the total number of hours at which all bees had died. That's sad. Okay, based on their findings, the researchers claimed that at a constant temperature, increasing humidity tended to decrease the bees' survival time. Okay, so this is important because there are a bunch of conditions here, but we don't need to focus on or zero in on all of those conditions. We need to look at the constant temperature, varying humidity, and show that it would take less time for all the bees to die when you have higher humidity. And so the relative humidity is varying here. And we can see that what's going on. So mean plus or minus SE. I'm surprised they would give that kind of abbreviation. This would mean mean plus or minus standard error, which is kind of like standard deviation. So these are the error bars that show like the kind of like the margin of error, sort of. But we can ignore those little error bars and just focus on the heights of these things. So under different temperatures and relative humidity treatments. So I think the important thing here is that as the humidity increases, the survival time decreases, and that's true. Yeah, the lowercase levels indicate significant differences between them under the different temperatures, and the numbers indicate significant differences under the different humidity levels. Okay, that's weird. But I think the important thing here is that for any of the temperatures, you know, if we're looking at the 45 degree temperature, the lowest bar is the one at 70% humidity. And then if we're looking at the 40 degrees, I mean, these are actually pretty similar, but I would say that that is at least a downtrend. And then here, definitely, that's the lowest for the 35 degree. It doesn't say what temperature, you know, they said a constant temperature, but it doesn't say what that constant temperature was. But I think the important thing here is that we do have decreases in the survival time as the humidity increases. So at 35 degrees Celsius, the survival time was significantly lower at 60 and 70 than it was at 50. So that is correct. At 35 degrees Celsius, the survival time, and this is a constant temperature. So it could be, in terms of the idea of a constant temperature, it could be A or B, because both of these talk about a constant temperature, whereas C and D are talking about a constant humidity and a varying temperature. Okay, so A and B at least have the right setup, but I think it's still going to be A, because B is saying, the differences in survival times were not significant. Well, that could be true, but that's not going to support their claim. We want data that's going to support their claim, and that would be, yes, what we see with, this versus these two. We've got a decrease. As you increase the humidity, the survival time decreases, and that is most clearly demonstrated at the 35 degree temperature. At the 35 degree temperature, so our answer here will be A. Data to complete the text. So, research suggests that REM sleep in animals is homeostatically regulated. Animals compensate for periods of REM sleep deprivation by increasing subsequent REM sleep. When on land, fur seals get enough REM sleep, but during the weeks they're in the water, they get almost none. In a study on fur seals' sleep habits, researchers recorded the REM sleep as a percentage of baseline of fur seals once they had returned to land. They concluded that REM sleep may not be homeostatically regulated in fur seals, citing as evidence. Okay, so if homeostatically regulating sleep means compensating for periods of sleep deprivation by increasing it later, and if they're concluding that it may not be homeostatically regulated in fur seals, that means they would not compensate. They would not compensate for low REM sleep with increased REM sleep later. So basically, let's say that let's cut out the part about REM sleep just to simplify this for a second. If you slept 4 hours one night, and that means you're behind on sleep, would you compensate for it the next night by sleeping 12 hours so that you would then average 8 hours for those 2 days? Or if you slept 4 hours one night, would you sleep 10 hours the next 2 nights to compensate for it? If you were a seal, something like that. So we would expect to see a big increase in the REM sleep the next day if they did homeostatically regulate it, but if they don't, we would not expect to see that. Okay, so what is going on here? So REM sleep as a percent of baseline after an extended period in water. So if they're in water, they get almost none. So basically, we would expect to see, let's see, they're back on land here. Increasing subsequent REM sleep. Why don't they show us? As a percent of baseline. Okay. If it were 100% of baseline, that would mean it was the normal amount, right? Because let's say that you, on average, sleep 8 hours. If you sleep 9 hours, then you're sleeping more than 100. If you sleep 8 hours, you're sleeping 100% of the baseline. If you sleep less than 8 hours, you'd be sleeping less than 100%. If you sleep more than 8 hours, it'd be more than 100%. So kind of a tough graph to interpret. But what I would say here is that 3 of the seals, seal C did not sleep anymore or have any more REM sleep than normal. It actually had less on day 1. And then seal B had less sleep on day 2. And seal C only had a little bit more sleep on day 3. So there's 3 cases where it's not really an increase. I think we could debate their conclusion, because in 3 other cases it is a significant increase. But if we want to complete their text, to complete the statement that it may not be homeostatically regulated, we would want to point to this evidence. It's not about the differences between the seals. It's not about the difference between B, A, and C. And why do they do it in B, A, and C? Why wouldn't they do A, B, C? I don't know. It's not about that difference. It's about the difference between when they were in water previously and now that they're on land. How much more are they having REM sleep or undergoing REM sleep? They didn't show significantly less. It's not about the second day compared to the first day. It's about days 1 and 2 compared to the baseline. They didn't consistently demonstrate a significant increase in REM sleep after their period of deviation in the water. Yeah, they didn't consistently demonstrate it, because 3 of the 6 measurements show either a slight decrease or only a very slight increase. So only 3 of the 6 did show a significant increase. D is tempting, but note here that it doesn't show us anything about REM sleep while in the water. Okay, and so D is tricky, because certainly the assumption would be that it would be very low. If they get almost no REM sleep when they're in the water, we would expect, we wouldn't expect them to get any REM sleep in the water. But this graph doesn't show anything about REM sleep in the water. Again, it's showing as a percentage of baseline. So this would be the average amount of REM sleep they get. Would be, that would mean we're at the 100 line. Again, above it means above the baseline, more than normal. Below it means below the baseline or less than normal. And we just don't have a consistent increase or a significant increase consistently demonstrated, and so our answer is going to be C. So a tough one. I got a little bit tongue-tied there, but that is going to be our answer for number 11. And then one last one, data to support the researchers' conclusion. So researchers monitored individuals' velocity and the surrounding crowd density as a group of study participants walked through a space and navigated around an obstacle. Who knows what that obstacle was? Maybe it was a fire pit. I don't know, or a bottomless pit with demons at the bottom. Who knows? Participants rated how congested it seemed before the obstacle, after the obstacle, and overall. and the researchers correlated those ratings with velocity and density. Correlations range from -1 to 1, with greater distance from 0 indicating greater strength. Yes, if there's 0 correlation, there's just no relationship. If there's a correlation of 1, it's a perfect positive correlation, meaning that as one goes up, the other one also goes up. If it's a -1 correlation, it means that as one goes up, the other one goes down. Okay. The researchers concluded that correlations with velocity are stronger than those with density. Okay, correlations with velocity are stronger than those with density. And here's a case where we are really focused on the absolute value. As it says, greater distance from 0 indicates greater strength. And so if we were to put these two numbers on a number line, one of them is going to be farther from 0 than the other, even though it just so happens to be negative, right? Because it's 0.7447. That's out here. Let's see if I can get my distances proportional. If that's 0, then -0.85 would be, it's going to be farther. It's going to be farther from 0. And so that's what we want to focus on here. So for the correlation between congestion ratings from before, further than, no. That's overly complicated and not accurate. B, the correlation between congestion ratings from before the obstacle and velocity. No, we want velocity versus density. For each of the three ratings, the correlation is not about negative versus positive. For each of the three ratings, correlations with velocity are further from 0 than the corresponding correlations with density are. Okay, so it's not just the overall, it's the all three of them. But that is true because that's got a higher absolute value than that, and that does as well. So in each case, this is farther from 0 than that is, and so it's going to be